The cross or crucifix is such a central figure in our churches, in our homes and in our faith. In this series, I'm going to be looking at 6 examples of the cross, of the crucifix, throughout the history of art, and seeing what they can tell us about our journey of faith as a church, about what the cross can say to us today, and about how these representations have changed over the years. Welcome to 6 Crosses. Hello there, and welcome to the first of this Lenten series, looking at 6 crosses, representations of the crucifixion in art dating over the last 2,000 years. I'm going to be dealing with these different images in chronological order, so obviously this first episode needs to go back to the beginning. Where do we start in terms of the depiction of the crucifixion in art? Well, one of the problems is that at the very beginning of the church, we simply didn't. For the first few centuries, there is no representation of the crucifixion of Jesus in art. Art at that time obviously was limited. This is a time when occasionally the church was under persecution, and so it couldn't be as open as perhaps it would be in later centuries. And so art tended to be restricted to the places of burial, so mausoleums and especially the catacombs in Rome. That's where we find the earliest examples of Christian art, frescoes and also inscriptions carved into marble. And we see many beautiful scenes. Very popular are scenes from the Old Testament, stories like Noah coming out of the ark, like Daniel in the lion's den, or the 3 young men in the burning fiery furnace, Moses striking the rock to bring water for the people. We also see lots of New Testament scenes, miracles of Jesus, such as the raising of Lazarus or the multiplication of the loaves, scenes like the Last Supper, and also representations of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, the most common way in which he is depicted in the earliest art of the Christian church. Those marble slabs that covered the burial places of individual Christians also featured a great many symbols like the fish, perhaps one of the most famous examples of early Christian symbolism, the Greek word ichthus, giving us the first letters in Greek of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. As well as the fish, we have things like the anchor. We have surprising images like the peacock. But we don't see the cross. We don't see the crucifixion of Jesus at all, anywhere. Now, there's a question. Was this because early Christians didn't believe in it? Well, no, of course they did. We know from the Bible, from the very earliest writings in the Bible, the letters of St. Paul, we know that the cross was absolutely central to the faith of Christians. We know that the crucifixion of Jesus was that central defining moment of that faith that we share. We see how the 4 Gospels, all of them, make so much room for the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. So it would be ridiculous for us to say that the cross did not feature in the faith and understanding of those earliest Christians. The theory as to why they didn't depict it in art, there are various theories, but the one that I find most convincing is simply because crucifixion was still common at that time, in those early centuries. Remember, this wasn't a special punishment that was reserved for Jesus. The Romans used crucifixion all the time. It was the punishment reserved for slaves or for foreigners. If you're a Roman citizen, no, you wouldn't be crucified. Remember the story of St. Paul. But anyone else, yes. You could be crucified outside the walls of your city. And it was a horrible and a humiliating death, but that was the point of it. It wasn't meant to be a quick, painless death. It was meant to be a long, drawn-out exposure. And as I say, it was very common. As Christians continued to worship in the 1st and 2nd century, they would have seen people still being crucified outside their cities. And so perhaps the image of crucifixion, with its associations with slavery, with humiliation, with revolt against the Roman Empire, it might have been a little bit too raw. Perhaps the example, as I've once read, is if we as Christians were asked to use a modern day means of execution, like the hangman's noose, or the electric chair as the symbol of our faith, we might feel a little bit strange about it. So perhaps that's why the very earliest Christians, who are still accustomed to seeing crucifixion as a reality in their lives, may have been less confident about actually depicting Christ as the crucified. They preferred to see him as the Good Shepherd, a much more comforting message perhaps to a church that was still occasionally facing persecution. So, what does this mean? We start our journey through the cross many centuries into the history of the Christian church? No, because there is one rather unusual example, which I think says an awful lot and is very significant. It dates from around about the year 200. So we're talking about the very earliest idea of the representation of the crucifixion. But the problem with this is it's not a Christian image. It's actually an anti-Christian image. What we're talking about is this. Its name is the Alexamenos Graffito. What it is a little piece of graffiti actually scratched into the plaster of a room in a Roman building. It was found in the middle of the 19th century in a building called the Pedagogium at the bottom of the Palatine Hill, connected to one of the imperial palaces of ancient Rome. The Pedagogium was some sort of schoolroom. It was a place where perhaps the young pages or youngsters attached to the imperial court would receive their lessons. And it seems as though one bored youth, in some moment perhaps when teacher wasn't being particularly interesting, has actually taken his stylus and scratched this image into the plaster of his schoolroom. And remarkably, it has survived to be discovered all those centuries later. It's now safely kept in a museum. What does it show? Well, let's look at it closely. What we see on this scratched graffito are a couple of images of figures and some writing, some text. The figures are one on a cross. That's unmistakable. We're viewing it from behind. We see this figure on the cross, what's called a tau cross, a T-shaped cross. And perhaps the most distinctive thing about this figure is he has a donkey's head, the head of an ass. To the side of him is the second figure, who seems to be worshipping. His hand is raised in this gesture of greeting or salutation. And then the writing that's underneath that is written in Greek. It's written in bad Greek, and it's scrawled in quite bad Greek as well. And it says, Alexamenos sebete theon, which means something like Alexamenos worships God, or Alexamenos worships his God. So what we have here is obviously the figure with the arms raised, that's meant to represent Alexamenos. And the figure on the cross is meant to represent Alexamenos' God. Now, who could this be? I'm sure you've already jumped to the conclusion. Various authors have looked at the different possibilities as to whether this could be anyone else, but none of their arguments are convincing. The only person that we can talk about as a crucified God is Jesus. So what we seem to have here is a very early little piece of graffiti bullying, mocking Alexamenos as a Christian who has obviously mentioned the worship of Jesus who was crucified, perhaps quoting some of those letters from St. Paul, perhaps relaying the story from the Gospels. And his friends obviously find this ridiculous. How can you worship someone crucified like a slave? And so that's where this act of mockery comes from. That's why the figure on the cross is depicted with a donkey's head, an ass's head. It's all about making this look as ridiculous as it would sound to a Roman, to make it look stupid. And so the mockery of Alexamenos, of his faith in the crucified God, is so vividly represented here. It's not difficult for us to imagine a group of teenage boys picking on one of them because he's perhaps been foolish enough to let slip that he is part of this Christian sect. Perhaps they've been asking him, pretending to be sincere about what his faith is, and he's looked at the opportunity to evangelise, to explain his faith, and has told them about the crucifixion. And perhaps then things have turned, and suddenly the mockery of young Alexamenos has actually started. And this little piece of graffiti is a testimony to that. But I think it's so much more. It actually also acts as testimony to the Christian faith in the power of the cross, even in the face of this mockery, even though it is, as St. Paul himself admitted, complete folly to talk about the cross, to talk about the crucifixion, even though when St. Paul was preaching in Athens and they were really interested in what he said until he got to the mention of Jesus' death and resurrection, at which point they laughed at him. This faith in the crucified God is revealed in this little graffiti. And that's why, even though, as I say, it might be very peculiar, even though it might be a little bit of an odd representation, this actually stands as our first cross, as the first representation of the crucifixion. The fact that it's mockery, the fact that it is an anti-Christian statement, that shouldn't take away from what it actually reveals, that faith in the crucifixion of Jesus was strong right then, at the end of the 3rd century, at the beginning of the 3rd century in the year 200. So, what does this say to us? Things to think about. Obviously, there are some people who still find the cross not the most convincing image of a religion. People perhaps who would dismiss it, who would be rid of it. People who doubt that the thing actually happened. Sometimes if you're seen wearing a cross, whether it's one on a lapel or perhaps a cross around your neck, or if you have a cross up on the wall in your home, people may look and say, that's a bit strange. Oh, that's a bit extreme. Why have you got that there? It's obviously still a source sometimes of mockery. In some places in the world, to possess a cross will mean that you can be persecuted. So we've got to ask ourselves, in the face of derision, of mockery or persecution, are we willing to hold on to the cross of Jesus? Do we realise what it says? The fact that our God could become a slave who could be executed in this most brutal and humiliating fashion. What does that say to us about God? And how does his humiliation on the cross help us? I wonder if it helped Alexamenos, as he was mocked and bullied and probably cruelly treated by his mates in the school, in the pedagogium and the imperial palace. I wonder whether he felt a closeness to Jesus on the cross, whether he felt some strength from the fact that his God had entered into the same condition that he was facing, and whether young Alexamenos persevered in his faith. I like to think that he did, and I like to think that he found great comfort in the cross of Jesus, even though that was used against him. Next week, we're going to cycle forward a few centuries to look at another image of the cross. We are staying in Rome, but something a lot more colourful, a lot more beautiful, a lot more inspiring perhaps than the graffito, the scrawled thing that we've looked at today. So, look forward to seeing you next Friday. In the meantime, hope you're having a good Lent. God bless. Keep on going.